Our new unit on heredity and genetics is going to take us into a new area where we're learning about how traits are passed on from one generation to the next. So what are genetic traits? These are characteristics that are passed from our parents down to the children or to the offspring if it's plants. So you may have said, oh, I got that from my dad, or I got my nose from my mom, or my hair color comes from my dad. And so those are characteristics, those are physical traits that we get from our parents. Inside the nucleus of every cell is the genetic code that is passed down from the parent to the offspring. Each parent in sexual reproduction gives half of the genetic code to their offspring. So dad gives half the genetic code, mom gives half the genetic code. And depending on which traits are dominant and recessive, they may receive different codes. The chromosomes that are in the nucleus are made of DNA strands. DNA is formed in a double helix. About 15 years ago, scientists undertook the project called the Genome Project of uncoiling all of the chromosomes in the human body and then determining where each of the genes were located on the whole DNA strand. So if there was a mistake on, let's say someone had a birth defect, they could go to that DNA strand and tell exactly where that mistake happened, where the genetic code was messed up. So we talk about genetic traits being passed down from parent to offspring. And when we talk about that, most of us would think of sexual reproduction, but it can also be passed down through asexual reproduction. And I wanted to share with you some of the types of sexual and asexual reproduction. So don't always think that it is just through animals, because plants actually undergo sexual reproduction too. When you see pollen on a flower, that's sexual reproduction that's going to take place because that pollen is going to fertilize the egg. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, we're always talking about fertilization of an egg, where there's a sperm or there's pollen that is going into the egg, and then a zygote is being formed, which is ultimately going to result in a new organism. I want to share with you some ways that organisms reproduce asexually. For example, in the strawberry, it may reproduce through runners. The donkey ear plant at the back of the room has little tiny plants growing on its leaf. They grow right on the leaf and then they fall off and become new plants. Flatworms can reproduce asexually by just being split in half or cut in any portion, and they will reproduce two separate organisms. Starfish, you've probably heard many stories about whenever they cut up the starfish and threw them back into the ocean, they reproduced and multiplied so much because they continue to reproduce asexually. Hydra and yeast reproduce through budding. A little tiny formation will come on the side, and then it'll eventually grow and split off until a new organism has been formed. And finally, in reproduction, mistakes can happen because this large double helix strand of DNA, sometimes the pieces stick together, sometimes they don't join correctly, sometimes they break, and then there's a genetic mutation that happens. Sometimes this forms cancer, sometimes this forms birth defects.